In my last lecture, I noted that the College Board pretty much skips over the 300 years of European history represented on this slide, with one big exception. And what exception is that? The map gives you a big hint, by the way. Invasions. One of the invasions depicted on the map was the Muslim invasion of Spain, which established the splendid Umayyad Caliphate center in Cordoba. Remember these works? But with the exception of Muslim Spain and some brief cultural flourishing in Celtic Britain and Ireland, Charlemagne's France, and the early Ottonian Empire, the years 700 to 1000 were not great times for Europe or for European art. Invasions, disease, and depopulation of once flourishing Roman towns left most Europeans huddled under castles for protection and exploitation, living at bare subsistence levels. But around the middle of the 11th century, things looked up for the people of Western Europe. We are going to focus on two major religious and artistic developments in this period: the increasing importance of pilgrimage and the rise of great monastic orders. But let me note that non-art historians are more likely to name population growth as the most important development in this period. The population of England, for example, is thought to have almost quintupled in the Romanesque era, from around 1 million to around 5 million people. So, why this population explosion? Well, Europe got a break from the plague. As the graph indicates, it would come back in the 14th century with a vengeance. The Viking raids slowed down, and one group of Viking invaders, the Normans, settled in Western Europe, and these are the folks who created the Bayeux Tapestry, which we studied last class. They also built some splendid late Romanesque and early Gothic cathedrals. Iron plows opened more land for cultivation. Germans settled the Slavic hinterland, and all through Europe people cleared forests and grew more crops. More food meant more people, a lot more people. Together, these developments began to transform feudalism. At the end of the Roman Empire, urban centers had lost most of their population or disappeared altogether. Now medieval Europeans flocked to towns. For one thing, any serf who could manage to stay in town for a year and a day without getting captured by his lord became a freeman. Money also returned to the economy in this period. People didn't just barter for goods. As more town dwellers had money to build churches, craft guilds began to compete with monasteries as producers of religious art. Pilgrimage played an important role in reviving towns and reviving the traditions of Roman architecture and monumental stone sculpture. So let's turn now to the first part of an old but excellent video on Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals. Pay special attention to the role played by relics. It's critical to understanding our required works from this period. Remember that the ECB will often ask you to relate the architecture of sacred spaces to religious beliefs and practices. As we just saw, Romanesque churches were designed to accommodate pilgrimage. But the great Romanesque churches were also, for the most part, monastic abbeys rather than diocesan cathedrals. To understand their form and function, you need to know something about monasticism as well. Let's continue with the video. And now we move to our only required work for today, admittedly one that comes with 4 required images. Since I pick on the College Board from time to time, let me note that it's a great relief to focus on just one Romanesque pilgrimage church, and that I really like the one they picked, the Church of Sainte Fois in Conques, France. I've circled the town on the map. As you can see, the church is on one of the popular routes leading towards Santiago de Compostela, the Cathedral of St. James in Spain. And now you get another break from my disembodied voice, and as a bonus, you have the opportunity to hear a genuine expert talk about this church. We'll start with his explanation of why Conques and its patron saint were so important to pilgrims. Take notes into your workbook, especially when he talks about the reliquary statue, which is one of the 4 required images from this church and which very frequently shows up on the AP exam. I thought an especially fun detail was the different origins and materials of the head and the body. Also, and you can come back to this after you watch the clip, think about why our lecturer calls this reliquary statue a living work. So, let me recap just a little before we move on to look at the tympanum. The floor plan of the Church of Santa Fois is not one of your required images, but I think the floor plan makes it easier to see how the Basilican church design evolved to address the needs of pilgrimage and monastic worship. The radiating chapels, shown here in pink, held the relics, and the ambulatory, shown here in light blue, made it easier for pilgrims to get to the relics without disturbing the monks during their many religious services. The transept was now quite wide to accommodate crowds, and the church architect added a transept exit, more crowd control. The interior photo on the right, which is a required image, reveals a nave with only 2 levels, although the apse has 3. The nave is covered with a rounded arch barrel vault defined by a series of transverse arches, the most characteristic feature of Romanesque churches. Rather oddly, the required image doesn't show the series of arches. It cuts off the photo too soon. I think this photo is clearer. The bottom level with the arched opening is the arcade, the nave arcade. The upper level, where women would be seated and pilgrims may have slept, is the gallery. In late Romanesque and Gothic churches like Chartres, the gallery will flatten out and become a decorative triforium rather than a space for holding additional worshippers. Note that in this church, only the apse has a layer of clerestory windows. The nave does not. So, if you were asked to provide a visual analysis of this space, what adjectives would you use? Some adjectives I came up with are massive, heavy, monumental, soaring, and even dark. Those clerestories do not really illuminate the nave. Here's a more generic Romanesque plan, but I'm including it to share a few more important terms. The choir in pale yellow is the space between the transept and the apse. The altar would be placed in the apse. This area is often a step or two higher than the nave, and it's called a choir because traditionally the clergy of the cathedral stood here as a chorus, chanting or singing during the responsive portion of the Mass. What I really want you to notice is the crossing, the deeper green square where the transept intersects the nave. The crossing square, which would be set apart by massive arches and piers, is the basic geometric unit of the Romanesque church. Each bay of the nave, that is, each section between the piers, would be exactly 1/2 of the crossing square. Each aisle bay measures exactly 1/4 of the crossing square. Remember that builders lacked our modern-day measuring tools, no CAD/CAM here. This geometric organization helped ensure the uniformity and symmetry of the building, while enabling builders to expand their plans by adding additional squares. In other words, this is an early and very important form of modular construction. Here's a photo of the Church of Santa Fois crossing square topped by a cupola. The photo on the right isn't one of your required images of the church. The image on the left is, but I've included it because this photo shows the cupola over the crossing square and gives you a clearer view of the semicircular apse and the radiating chapels that held the relics. Note also the so-called Westwork Towers. They're named that because, they are usually placed on the west-facing side of the church. These add to the verticality of the space. You saw these, I hope, in the Church of St. Michael's in my last lecture. And here's an interior view of the ambulatory. One of the ways that Romanesque church architects supported the heavy barrel vault stone ceilings was by erecting buttresses. In Romanesque churches, these buttresses were engaged stone columns. That is, they were columns attached to the church wall. I've circled one here in red. We'll see more spectacular buttresses in our next lesson and next church. To hold up those heavy stone vaulted ceilings, Romanesque builders constructed massive piers. Here's still another view of Santa Fois' nave and a diagram that offers more detail about a compound pier. I don't think you need to know all of these terms, but you should know compound pier. Another feature that sets Romanesque churches apart is the use of historiated capitals, that is, column capitals that tell a narrative. This is not a required image, but it does tell the story of Santa Fois, so I'm going to have you continue the World's Greatest Churches video here. Now we come to our final required work from the Church of Santa Fois. In the past, AP questions about Romanesque art have often focused on this tympanum. Why? Well, in part because the elaborate tympanum sculptures that decorated the entryway to most Romanesque churches were carved in stone. Given our breakneck pace through Christian art, you may not have even noticed. But monumental stone sculpture basically disappeared from European art for more than 700 years, from the late Roman Empire to the era of the Romanesque pilgrimage churches. Also, no depiction of Christ is more iconic of Romanesque art than Christ as the final judge of all human beings. Our expert will explain why and give us a wonderful close-up tour of this complex sculpture. We've included many of these images in your workbook, so you have more note-taking opportunities, right? This is very detailed, more than you really need to know, but the wealth of messages really captures the religious and artistic spirit of the Romanesque age. You may run out of time. If that happens, I urge you to finish watching this video.